this is the central doctrine of Christianity. It is right at the heart of what the Christian gospel is. Christ died for our sins. That's our central affirmation.
So what is Dr. William Lane Craig here talking about? What doctrine is he talking about? He's talking about none other than penal substitutionary atonement, that it is central. At least that's my understanding of what he's addressing here. We're going to discuss this here in a moment with Brother James Agnew, who is a podcaster like myself on YouTube in philosopher's garb, and he's also written a book called The Devil's Disbarment, which I have just finished reading today. It's a good read, and he's on here today. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about this clip and more about penal substitutionary atonement, as well as James's view. So here, without further ado, welcome, James.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, good to have you on. We learned backstage that James and I kind of have something in common in that he's currently in New Zealand and we call New Zealand home. So that was good fun.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your podcast and your book. And yeah,
for sure. Yeah. So I don't have a podcast. I just do like mainly YouTube and TikTok. So my kind of go-to joke when people ask me to introduce myself is to be like, I'm just another, dishonest, dirty apologist on the internet, because, that's how apologist gets, portrayed. So I started a TikTok a while back, mainly focusing on just stuff related to mere Christianity, objecting to ridiculous, objections and stuff like that. And then also was putting a lot of that content on my YouTube. Nowadays, if you look at my YouTube, a lot of it is more related to projects in theology that I've been doing. So I finished a doctorate in theology not too long ago, maybe like 4-ish months ago, something like that. And I did my doctoral dissertation on canonic Christology and defending that. So I have some videos up about that. While working on my dissertation, I got sidetracked into atonement stuff and it kind of ended up completely reevaluating and restructuring how I view atonement. And so the result of that is the book that we are, talking about some today, The Devil's Disbarment. So yeah, I just make stuff related to anything kind of in general related to like theology, apologetics, sometimes philosophy, stuff like that. I don't have like a clear, I just kind of do whatever I want, whatever I feel like doing. And sometimes
I just do things, I just record them and upload them.
Like, do I look like the type of guy who has a plan? Like I'm just kind of putting stuff out there as I do a lot of response videos. Like I feel like response videos are something that they give you an interlocutor to work with. So like I put up videos responding to guys like Mike Winger, William Lane Craig, people along those lines. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I chose this clip today, because I wanted to interact with someone that holds to penal substitutionary atonement. For those of you that are new to our series here, so last week I interviewed Will Hess, and he has a book called Crushing the Great Serpent, Did God Punish Jesus? And I'm still about halfway through that book. It might actually end up being 3/4 of the way by the time you measure all of the bibliography and stuff. And then I started reading your book for this interview, James. And then next week, we are going to be interviewing Brother David Allen, who is a pro PSA guy. He's written a book on the extent of the atonement that's about like this thick. And then there's his smaller work just called Atonement, which is he doesn't, as far as I can tell so far, explore atonement theories. He's mainly talking about penal substitution, as well as a lot of objections that Calvinists make to a universal extent of the atonement is in there in an abridged version. And so we engage with a lot of Calvinists here on the channel. But I wanted to play this debate. So I'm only showing one clip of this, and you can watch the debate for yourselves. If you're kind of on the fence on these issues, I think you'll mostly find it frustrating because as I listened to this debate between Greg Boyd and William Lane Craig, I felt like, man, they just kind of talked around a lot of the issues, and it was interesting. It was charitable. You do kind of see, some potential problems and strengths and weaknesses of different views. But he said this at the end, and I thought, wow, as somebody that is currently, I think, PSA, but questioning and sort of investigating these other views, when he said this thing at the end, I just wasn't sure that I agreed with him. And so I thought we'll put this up here and talk about this for a little bit, and then we'll talk about some of the things in your book. But here's so Justin Brierley is going to ask the question, why is this important? And then you'll hear Brother Bill, if I can call him that.
We don't need more encouragement in that area.
Why do you believe it's so important to get this theology of atonement right, Bill?
Because this is the central doctrine of Christianity. It is right at the heart of what the Christian gospel is. Christ died for our sins. That's our central affirmation. And so I think it's vital that we understand that doctrine, and then also, Justin, be able to defend it against those who would object to it.
This is one thing that you highlighted in your book, that, you know, there's not a small amount of debate in the scholarly circles surrounding penal substitution and whether or not it's cogent, whether or not it's biblical, whether or not it's philosophically sound and things. Now, before I give my opinion, why don't you just talk a little bit about what Brother Bill here said and just give your opinion or your take?
So I want to make sure I represent Craig correctly, because he was asked about the atonement in general. And when asked about why is it important we get the atonement, it seems like just in general, right? He says it's because it's the heart of the faith. Now, I think I'm very sympathetic to that. I would probably agree. Like, I do think that's probably the heart of the faith, is the fact that we have been able to be reconciled to God. We can be made, at one with God through the work of Christ. Now, so I agree that it's at the heart of the faith. Now, Craig emphasizes there that Christ died for our sins. And he puts a lot of weight on that. And obviously, I want to affirm that, right? Christ died for our sins. But what I want to do, and this is something that has been, I think, one of my big kind of like nitpicking points when I critique penal substitution and when I talk with people about it, is that's only telling like maybe not even half the story. I want to say that's like 1/3 of the heart of the gospel. The heart of the gospel is that Christ died for your sins, was raised, and now serves eternally as your intercessor in heaven. And that's the big thing that really led me to questioning PSA, is because PSA gives me a story in which it's all about the death. Like, Jesus had to die, and then, okay, boom, death, it's finished, right? And like, me and God are good to go now. But then I look in the Bible, and what I see is that's not really how the entire New Testament depicts it. The entire New Testament gives me the idea that I'm able to be saved to the uttermost, not just because Jesus died, but because of stuff he does afterwards, namely going to heaven and serving as my advocate there. And what I would say is the devil's disbarment that we get from Revelations 12. It's kind of, you can see you can see the influence of Revelations 12, the idea of Satan. He had this place in heaven to accuse us. He gets cast out by the blood of the Lamb. That's why I want to say the heart of the gospel. So to summarize there, I agree with Craig on a lot of this, but I feel like a lot of penal substitution advocates, he has been conditioned to think about Christ's salvific work primarily in terms of death. And I'm going to say it's not just death, it's death, resurrection, and then intercession.
Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that. And that's kind of what's been part of my journey is I think I started this by buying Reclaiming the Atonement by Patrick Reardon on a whim. For those of you that are triggered by this, I'm sorry, but he's Eastern Orthodox. I'm a little bit triggered by it, to be honest. And I was just thinking about the incarnation and how that's an aspect of Christ's work that's really important in the lead up to Christmas this past year. And so that kind of began this idea, this exploratory thing of, I think that I need to start digging into the atonement. And Brother David Allen's book, Atonement, was something that was on my wish list for Christmas. So I got that on Kindle for Christmas. I've not yet finished that, but have given myself a interview deadline to make sure that I finish it. And, but yeah, what you said, I think is important, because for those among our viewers that are very PSA, like perhaps myself, although I have increasing amount of questions about it, I think it's really important that we explore the other ideas and concepts surrounding Christ's work and his atonement. And that's something I think that your book does well as far as with your view. And it's why I wanted to have you on here to discuss your view. And yeah, I think the intercession is really important. And I don't know, there's so many different places that we could begin. I think that we could just sort of walk. Your book's pretty small, I think. I read it on a Kindle and it didn't take me long, so I assume it's relatively thin.
Yeah.
As compared with Will Hess's, it took me a little bit longer, or is taking me longer. But maybe we can talk a little bit first about, and we can get into some of the questions about PSA towards the end, which I'm sure lots of people are just itching to get to.
Yeah.
But you build your argument talking about gods, that there's more than one God, and that Yahweh is the supreme God. And I can definitely see how that would trigger me, and maybe does trigger me a little bit, as well as some of our viewers. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and build some of that case here tonight?
Yeah, so when you said it, I was like, okay, people are gonna start going for the red X at the top right of their screen, right? So so here's what I mean by that. I'll step back for a second and say that the idea that I articulate of there being multiple gods. I also, like, when I first encountered this, I was like, this is whack. I was like, because like we've been conditioned, like we grew up in, at least I grew up in Protestant America, and if there's anything you've heard, it's that there's no other God besides Yahweh or something like that. It's like God, there's only one God. And depending on how you're using the word God, like that's true, right? The issue here, and the reason I say, I have a part of my book where it's like, why do the gods have authority, and why affirm the reality of other gods, is because as a lot of ancient Hebrew scholars, ancient Israelite scholars have pointed out, the way that we use the word God in the ancient Israelite world, the word that's translated for God in English, Elohim, it did not have the kind of theological, philosophical baggage that three-letter word in English does. So the word for Elohim in the Old Testament, Mike Heiser has written a lot of stuff about this. He's like a big, well-known name on this. That word is used to refer to the God of Israel. It's used to be a proper name. It's used to refer to God's, heavenly host. It's used to refer to what we would usually consider demons. It's even used at one point to refer to a dead human spirit. And so what people like Heiser would say is that the word Elohim, this is not, like the three-letter word God that we use that has all this, philosophical baggage of like, oh, omniscient, omnipotent, so on and so forth. That's kind of like a term of residence. That is a term that tells you where this being resides, namely in the spiritual realm. And how someone like Heiser would put it, which I think is right, is that there are other Elohim besides Yahweh. Like there are these other spiritual beings, but there is no Elohim like Yahweh. Yahweh is, as Heiser would say, species unique. He is the most high. In fact, he is the one who creates all the others. And so what I would say to people who are uncomfortable is I would say, listen, you probably already have in your theological framework something along the lines of this. Like you probably already think like, oh, God, you have God and he's got his angels and, so on and so forth. You probably already think there are other spiritual beings besides, God and us, right? You probably think there's other like beings out there. So I use the word gods because that is a word that it tracks with Old Testament translations that we see, and it tracks with how it's used in the Hebrew world. And in the New Testament, when the New Testament comes around, these kind of various labels that are used for these spiritual beings, sons of gods, holy ones, watchers, as Heiser himself points out, we kind of see the Greek word that's used that we get angel from. We see that kind of start to be a catch-all. It all kind of starts to get lumped in and referred to, and that's kind of how we are now, as we just lump these things into angel. But so let me kind of give a so I talk about the gods because my book is, I call it a divine council model of atonement. So the idea there is I'm drawing on Heiser's concept and like I said, other ancient other Hebrew scholars' concept of the divine council. And if you say, hey James, what in the world is that? Let me give you a kind of a really good a really short kind of explanation on what I mean by the divine council, and then let me give you maybe like a biblical proof text for that. So imagine you have like a normal everyday king, right? Like a king here on earth, right? You've got the king, and that king often has an entourage, right? You have the king, he's on the throne, and a lot of times he will have advisors around him. He will have servants around him who serve his needs, and to some degree, he gives, he delegates authority to. They are subservient to him. They serve him. Things along those lines. There's an idea of like there's a court, the king's court or the king's council. And the idea of the divine council is just that God, being the King of Kings, he also has this type of court. He also has this type of entourage, this council. And let me give you just a really kind of short proof text for this so we can get it really explicitly. So this is 1 Kings 22. We're told, I think this is also verses 19 through 23. So we're told that the prophet said, therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing and another said another. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. So okay, let me unpack this briefly. So the prophet here, which is Micaiah, he's saying all this, right? And he's describing this vision or this thing that he's seen. And in this scene that he's describing, you have the Lord, which is Yahweh, and he's sitting on his throne, and all the hosts of heaven are standing around him, right? So there's that entourage, there's that idea of the king being surrounded. So the king, Yahweh, is surrounded by the host of heaven, and they're standing by him. And then Yahweh invites them to, participate to some degree. He asks them, who's going to entice Ahab that he may go out and fall? And so they kind of discuss amongst themselves. One said one thing, one said another, and then a spirit comes forward, and they stand before the Lord, and they pitch this idea, right? And God says, yep, that'll do. And then that's the thing that ends up happening. So here we have an instance of, we've got Yahweh, he's on his throne, he's surrounded by these other spiritual beings, and he is inviting them in some degree. He's delegating authority. They are involved in the governance of the world, and they seem to have some type of real authority. I'll give one other instance of these beings having significant authority, and this is Daniel 4:13 through 37. So excuse me, 4:13 through 17. I'm not gonna do like 20 something verses here. Daniel 4:13 through 17. So this is, I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. Okay, so the idea here is this is a guy from heaven, right? This is a spiritual being. And he proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit. And then around verse 17, that speaker says, the sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know the Most High. So the idea here is the watchers are the one who have made this decree. The decision was by the word of the holy ones. And so this is done so that, we may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men in this way, and so on and so forth. But there's an idea here of this is being delivered by one of these watchers, and that idea of watcher is something that comes up elsewhere in, either the Old Testament. Actually, I think this is the only instance we see this word in the Old Testament, but it gets picked up in Second Temple, Jewish language, and like Book of Enoch and stuff. But the idea of those who watch is something that comes up, I think, in Zechariah. But the idea here is, you have these beings, and they seem to have some type of skin in the game, so to speak. They have some type of authority that's been delegated to them. So I incorporate all of this stuff. This is when I'm talking about, the gods, the Elohim. This is the type of language. This is the type of idea that I'm drawing into the conversation.
Good. Thanks for that intro. And we'll unpack some of this a little bit more as we go on. I want to answer some of the comments here because it reminded me of something that I wanted to say about what Craig said. And I might play, I guess it's not necessary for me to play him again. But so here we've got one of the very first comments came in, Drew. I'm not sure where you're going on your journey, but I hope and pray you're not attacking PSA. Okay, so here's my vulnerable moment with you all. So according to what Brother Bill has said here, this is, if he's talking about penal substitution, then he's saying it's central. Like, this is basically kind of what the gospel hinges on. And James, as you mentioned in your book, I mean, you taught this and evangelized with this and gave apologetics for this for years and years and years. And I'm the same way and have been the same way. And so I can definitely sense the fear of standing before you guys on this podcast, on this YouTube channel, and potentially causing some doubts or whatever on something that could be central. Like, I'm like, man, you know, if he's right about this, there's a certain amount of trembling that comes along with that. And I feel that for what it's worth, you know, but we also need to pursue the truth no matter where it leads. And the secondary point is that if penal substitution is false or is not central, and this is something like the main thing that we're defending, there are a lot of challenges and problems that come up among unbelievers. I mean, you mentioned a number of them, James, in your book. And if this, you know, it reminds me of that passage where Paul says we demolish arguments and strongholds that raise themselves up against the knowledge of Christ. So if there's something false, be it theological determinism, be it the penal substitution, if it's false, then that needs to be dealt with and eliminated so that there aren't obstacles. But similarly, there is another side of the coin. Like if it is central, then it's central, and we want to know that and believe that as well. So I feel the anxiety I guess that some people feel here with this, but I don't. And the reason why I share this clip from William Lane Craig with you all is that as I've done study and talked with people, that it just doesn't resonate with me anymore. I'm like, I mean, I feel like I hold to PSA. I have some questions, but I don't know that I would say that it's like central. I feel like there are different ways of conceptualizing that Christ died for your sin. And as long as you are trusting in him for the forgiveness of your sins, the mechanics of how that plays out, or whether it's divine counsel or PSA or whatever, I think it's very important. Don't get me wrong. I think it's very, very important. But I don't think it's salvific in the sense that we really need to just be throwing brothers and sisters out of the kingdom or whatever. And it kind of startled me because the logical implications of what he says, if we're being maybe a little bit less charitable, is that if penal substitution is central and you reject it, as Greg Boyd obviously does, then he's rejecting the gospel and the centrality of Christianity. And I'm not willing to say that. And I don't know that that's what Brother Bill was saying, but that's how what he could be saying. So
yeah, I was trying to be charitable in that clip that you saw, and I think he's talking about atonement in general, but I've seen Craig say things that would tempt me to give tempt me to say that would think along the lines of, no, PSA is the heart of the gospel. I mean, he calls it the crown jewel, or the table of the jewel, when it comes to the different motifs of the atonement. Like he thinks it's the big thing that holds it all together. And I share hesitation, and I share just in general when it comes to the atonement. Like I'll be going through my life and I'll be like, yeah, I'm not sure anybody really knows what's going on with atonement. You know, I wrote a book on this, and I've got like, this is the best story I can come up with to like make sense of the biblical data. But there are times I'm like, I don't know what's going on. You know, I mean, like I think like if we're being honest with ourselves, like we're in a pretty epistemically limited position. Yeah. And I think it may be that. So I think, so I'll say this. So penal substitution, Craig defines penal substitution really broadly. He defines it as something like Christ endured the suffering that if I had experienced it, it would have been the just punishment for my sins, or something like that. I think that's too broad. I think he's missing the primary like aspect of PSA, which is that the mechanism of atonement, or like the issue that needed to be fixed, is that God had all this justice and God had all this wrath, and he had to deal with that. And the mechanism of him dealing with that is Christ. So the ways that I phrase it that way is people cash it out differently. Some people are like, God has all this wrath from sin. He just can't let it go. He has to pour it out on Christ. So there it's all about the wrath. You could tell a similar story in which it's not about wrath. It's just about God's like, I'm really just. I can't just let this go and, be just. And so God's justice like compels him to like have to punish us. So in that story, it's all about the mechanism is all about God needs to do this to deal with some stuff that he has going on with him, either wrath or justice or whatever. Whereas you could give a model of the atonement, which you could even say it affirms God punishes us in some sense. But if the model that affirms that God punishes us in some sense, if that isn't a model in which the reason that occurs is because God just kind of had to, in a sense, get this out of his system. Like that's the best way I know how to phrase it. Like with some of the wrath language, it really seems like the idea there is like God has to get this wrath out of his system. If that's not it, then it doesn't seem to fall into kind of the general conception of penal substitution. So my go-to kind of example of this is like, if you hold to like a ransom theory or something, like you're going to think Christ suffered the consequences, bare minimum. Like Christ suffered the consequences for your sin. Now, at that point, whether or not it's consequences or punishment is going to depend on how you define punishment. But let's say we use a definition of punishment such that, like, if Christ suffers the consequences for your sin, then he suffered what would have been your punishment. It's like, okay, but like in a ransom theory, it's not about like God was really mad at you and he had to pour out wrath. Like in a ransom theory, it's about like, and essentially getting you out of Satan's clutches. You know what I mean? And so, and that's one of my big concerns that I have here with Craig, is making sure to not define PSA so broadly. What I attack in my book, and I think I make this clear towards the beginning of my PSA chapter, is I'm most focused on attacking the idea that the main mechanism of atonement, like the main issue that needed to be fixed, is God just had to punish someone to deal with his wrath or deal with his justice. And there are times I flirt with like, oh, maybe you could incorporate some type of, punishment element into my story. I don't end up going that route. I usually end up like talking myself out of it when I start to to go down that line. But if you're really, if you really wanted to, you could. But at that point, I would say that's still a pretty big departure from the type of stuff you see from like Craig or Schreiner or MacArthur or whatever. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that I found frustrating about this exchange between Boyd and Craig, was he was very clear up front. And I think the subtitle was here. I'll pull it up here as I'm saying this if I can. I don't know, my ADD is pretty strong, but that he said essentially what you said, which is that penal substitution is where Christ takes the punishment that would have been ours, if we had, so the subtitle of the debate is, did God punish Jesus on the cross? So it almost seems like in that discussion that Craig's answer could be potentially not, which feels like it's giving up a lot. And you highlight this, I think, towards the end of your book, because you build your own argument, and then you're like, hey, here's the main contender in Protestantism, evangelicalism, which is PSA. Now, and I think you highlighted essentially, is there substitution? Is there actual punishment for sins happening? And then who is doing the punishing? And you're basically saying these are the three criteria that need to be fulfilled. A substitution by itself doesn't work. Punishment by itself doesn't work. Even substitution with punishment, depending on who's doing the punishment, still doesn't get you to PSA. You need to have all these three things. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I think that's what we would expect to see, as you're saying, in the biblical data, in terms of if we're assessing the atonement models and what holds up to scrutiny and stuff. Like,
I think I just want to, but I think I also include, if you have those things, I think, if I remember correctly, I think I also say, and why are they doing the punishment? I think I add that in, because like, I think you could have a model in which you could affirm that like God's the one punishing Jesus. But if the reason he's doing that is because of, and I give an example in the book, if the reason he does that is not because like God's like, I'm so just, I'm so wrathful, I have to do this. If the reason he's doing that is to defeat an allegation, from like Satan or something, then that just doesn't seem to be, I mean, like that's closer to PSA. Like I'll admit, like that's way closer, but that's just still really different than the kind of typical PSA like conversation we get, where it's just like it's a typical conversation between PSA, or a typical picture between that set up a PSA, where it's you have God, you have us, and like that's the main thing. Like God has all this wrath, justice. If you set up a picture where, like, even if I grant you all this stuff, which I'm not likely to do, but even if I grant you all this stuff about like, okay, God's the one directly punishing Jesus, even if I give you that, what I'm going to ask is like, why is he doing that? Because if the reason he's doing that is because Satan and the cosmic baddies, like it's related to them, and that this is how, God overthrows Satan and the cosmic baddies, I'm going to say, even if you go down that route, like, okay, like that's way better. You're way closer in the direction, right? Like if I can move people a little bit away from like the Craig model, like, okay, I'll deal with that. And I think that's a little bit more plausible. So that's an important. So, I mean, an example of this is like, take something like C.S. Lewis's model of the atonement, which is the idea that he puts forth in the Chronicles of Narnia. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, Edmund, right, he sins, he's a traitor, he does something traitorous, he like hangs out with a white witch, like eats her toffee, something like that. And it's been a while since I read the book, don't at me. And as a result of that, he's captive to the White Witch. Now, if I remember correctly, the way the story goes is that Aslan and crew, they bust him out of the White Witch's clutches, right? It's okay, yay, like, you know, he's been freed. There's your kind of liberation from the cosmic baddies, Satan and the cosmic baddies. But then the White Witch comes and she accuses Aslan, and she says, you know, by the declare of the emperor across the seas, you know that I am due a traitor for every, act of treachery. You know that I'm owed him. And so, there's this idea of like, you have to give it back. And so the people that are on Aslan's side, they're like, so what? Like, what if this gets broke? And Aslan just like growls at them. Like, he's just like, like, we can't do that. We can't break the laws of the emperor across the seas, because if that happens, like, all of Narnia will come undone. So the idea there is that the White Witch, which is the Satan figure, is using this decree or this law by, the emperor across the seas, which I think is the substitution. It's kind of representing the idea of the father in Lewis's word. And it's through that the witch is using her claim on Edmund. So then what does Aslan do? He has a conversation with the witch. He acknowledges, like, okay, this has to be paid. But at that point, like, Aslan and Edmund are fine. Like, Aslan doesn't have a beef with Edmund. Aslan's not like, I gotta kill something. Aslan's not like, I got all this justice. It's this accusation that's coming from the witch, as it relates to the laws declared by the emperor. And so what ends up happening is Aslan voluntarily takes the place of Edmund. Like, they kind of strike up this deal. And then as, the White Witch kills Aslan, and then the story, as it goes, spoiler alert, is Aslan comes back from the dead. And then when Aslan is explaining to the girls, like, what happened? How are you back from the dead? Aslan says something like, the White Witch knew her magic. She knew her deep magic. She knew, all this stuff. But what she didn't know is that there was an even deeper magic, long before she was around, that says that, if an innocent, takes the place of the guilty, death itself will begin working backwards. All right, this is kind of poetic picture. Okay, so why do I bring this up? So, like, I think something like that, if you're like really hard set on wanting to say like God punishes Jesus, I think something in that framework is going to be the best you have, because it's in that framework of like, okay, it's punished, but it's because of these accusations by Satan. So like, that's a really good kind of example of like, if you really want to factor in like there needs to be some type of punishment there, that's the best thing. But that's still a far cry from like a Craig style PSA.
Yeah. And yeah, in the book, you talk a little bit more about this divine counsel and the accusation type stuff. And it is really interesting and really kind of mind expanding in terms of when you're thinking about the atonement and you're thinking about what Christ did, because and as I understand it, it's a little bit more common in like African American evangelicalism, or if that's what you want to call it, this idea of Christ, being vindicated, victorious over Satan and all this other stuff, which is, a little bit more narrowly Christus Victor, where yours is a little bit more kind of Christus Victor, but in such a way that the devil's accusations are thrown down in that. And you talk about Job and how, we see these dramas that happen in the heavenlies where these accusations are brought. Can you talk a little bit about, and you've alluded to this with your metaphor, with C.S. Lewis metaphor, but can you talk a little bit about how that is that, Christ dies, an innocent person dies, and then as he's resurrected and as that happens, somehow some kind of power shift happens. Talk about that a little bit, because if anybody is like me, 12 to 24 months ago or so, they will have just no idea about any of this stuff. So maybe this is just for past me. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll take a moment to hopefully, this can sound like worse than it is, hopefully give your audience the anguish that and the difficulty and the discomfort that I felt when I started rethinking the atonement, right? Because I used to be a hardcore PSA guys, right? I used to be on your side. Here's the things. So we should want a model of the atonement that incorporates as much as possible the biblical data, right? We should want to we should try to bring it all in. And as a lot of people who talk about atonement, they know like Craig goes on this idea of there are different motifs. And so you have some people who they take one motif and they say this is the most important thing, and they just zero in on that. Craig Loki kind of does that, right? That's my kind of one of my critiques of Craig is he's just like, this is the main thing, and he focuses on that. But then you have all these other, motifs. I'm like, well, why aren't they the main thing? Why isn't that going on? And I'll touch on some of those in a second. And then you have some other people, and they're like, I'm going to take all these motifs and I'm going to say, they're a mosaic. These are all different images that come together to make a mosaic. So you have actually a book called like Mosaic of Atonement, and it's not a horrible book. I actually used it in my researches. It has some good stuff. But I'm like, this mosaic looks more like a Frankenstein monster. It looks more like you just like took a bunch of like disconnected things and just like sewed them together into this like heap of flesh. And I'm just like, ugh. Like this isn't like I want a story. I want you to tell me a coherent story that incorporates all or as much as possible the biblical data or close to all the main biblical data. And so then what am I thinking of that are the main biblical data? So when I was wrestling through this, I came to the point that I thought, okay, PSA doesn't incorporate, at least the usual story I get, it doesn't incorporate all of the biblical data. Here are the pieces of the biblical data that I am on my mind that I'm like, okay, this is on the table. I have to put these together. So one big thing, Jesus died, and that's significant, right? So there's this idea of we are brought back. I guess we'll start with just the fact of the atonement. Fact of the atonement. We were in a pickle. Jesus got us out of it. We can all agree on that, right? So that's the fact of the atonement. Two, Jesus's death played like a really significant role in this. Like, okay, that's pretty obvious. Christ died for our sins, so on and so forth. Okay, three, it had to do with what I call Satan and the cosmic baddies. So like throughout the New Testament, there's just a constant stream of thought that we were subject to oppression and slavery and captivity to what I refer to as Satan and the cosmic baddie. So like Satan and his cohort. So Jesus, so I'll give this example. So when Jesus is tempted, right, Satan takes Jesus up to a high place and says, look at everything. It's all been given to me. I have authority over it. Worship me and I'll give it to you. And so here Satan is like claiming to have authority over like all this stuff. It's like, okay, so this is an explicit claim by Satan. And you might be tempted to be like, Satan's the, father of lies. We shouldn't trust him. It's like, yeah, but like other New Testament authors actually confirm what he just said there. So like Jesus refers to Satan as the ruler of this world. Paul refers to Satan as the god of this world. Like there's all this type of language. It seems to be like, no, like Satan lies a lot, but like here he's appealing to something he knows he actually has right. Like he has a degree of authority here. And so there's all this language in the New Testament. We see this, and I think it's 1 John. The reason the Son of Man came is to destroy the works of the devil. We see this idea, and I think it's Hebrews 2 of through death, Christ, defeats the one who has, the powers of death and slavery, which is the devil, stuff like that. We get this idea of, Jesus says he comes to bind the strong man so that he can plunder his house. This type of language. When Christ reads the Isaiah scroll, he says, "I've come to, give liberty to the oppressed, to free those who are in slavery." Like it's just a constant theme. Paul says, we were in the kingdom of darkness, we've been transferred to the kingdom of light. So on. Yeah, cosmic baddies. Yeah, that's my little I gotta have some humor in some things. So we have this huge motif of cosmic warfare, right, between God and Satan and the cosmic baddies. And so this is, side note, this is a critique I have with Craig, that he just like in his like setting up his data, I'm like, where is this, Craig? Like he might touch on it when he's talking about like like patristic models, but it doesn't seem to make the cut for like the big important things for him. So anyway, so that's a big one, right? So you got Jesus got us out of a pickle. It's because of him we can be close to God. His death had a big part of that. Satan and the cosmic batteries, what are we going to do with them? Okay, here's the two other pieces, right? Jesus's saving work, the most important part of that comes from what he does after he dies. It comes from actually what he does after he resurrects. So let me give you a couple of proof texts like to beat this in. So in Romans, right? So I think this is Romans 8:38. Paul is talking about how no one can, bring charges against us now, right? No one can, bring charges against the elect or something like that. Yeah, you got it up. So I think if you want to scroll down, I think it might be actually 34. Let's see. Yeah, I think it's maybe 34. How embarrassing. I can't even get my verse right. Yeah, so he says something like, okay, yeah, so, okay, here he is. So who can bring an accusation against God's elect? Who is the one who justifies? Who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is the one who died, but even more. Oh, so this next thing is more important. has been raised. Oh, raised. Okay. He also is at the right hand of God and intercedes for us. So in Paul's mind, what's more important than the death of Christ is that Christ has been raised, and that's connected. The importance of that seems to me to be connected in Paul's mind with the idea of Christ being there to intercede for us. And this idea of Christ being present to intercede for us, we get it a couple other places in Scripture, but it comes up really strongly in Hebrews. So if you want to bring up Hebrews 7:25, Drew. So all throughout the book of Hebrews, there's this idea of why did Jesus have to become like us? So this is a kind of a continual theme throughout the book of Hebrews is Jesus became like us in all respects so that he could be our merciful and faithful, high priest. So we could have this high priest who is, sympathetic to us. And if you want to go down to verse 25, yeah. And so the idea there is like, okay, in the mind of Hebrews, the importance of Jesus being our high priest, that's an ongoing role he has. So I'm going to start here reading at verse 23. Now, many have become Levitical priests since they are, prevented by death from remaining in office. So this idea is like, priests die, so you can't have one, eternal, normal priest in the Levitical system. But because he, referring to Christ, remains forever, he holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, since he always lives to intercede for them. I want to beat this in if you're a penal substitution advocate. The author of Hebrews, what they're doing there, they are connecting your ability to be saved. Why? Because Christ is currently living and is in heaven interceding for you. So this is a huge motif, and this is one of the big factors. Hebrews is really one of the biggest thing that completely crushed my conception of PSA, because in the mind of the author of Hebrews, the big central focus is you now have this present advocate before the Father. Okay, so that's the fourth point. And then here's the kind of the final piece of data that I'm going to say we have to work with. And again, these are like the really kind of broad things. There are some other pieces of data that I think are pretty easy to fit in kind of most systems, so I'm not going to talk about them. So the final piece of data is this idea of Jesus being a sacrifice, like a kind of, similar to a Levitical sacrifice, to a Levitical high priest. So understanding that, kind of broad, stream of thought in a way that is at least somewhat continuous with, like Old Testament Levitical sacrifice. Like there has to be some like if they're drawing on Jesus as like a Levitical sacrifice, if they're drawing on that as motif, like we can't have our understanding of Jesus as a sacrifice here just be like bonkers, like, off the rails different than how it was in the Levitical system. It doesn't have to necessarily be one for one, because this is, there's differences here, as the author of Hebrews he makes really explicit, but there has to be some type of conceptual continuity. Okay, so just take like 30 seconds, like pause this if it's recorded, and just think to yourself, how am I going to incorporate it? Give me a story that incorporates all 5 of those facts. It's really easy. If you start thinking about it, it's really easy to be like, okay, I got 1, 2, 3, and maybe even 4. Maybe you're good. Maybe you got 4. It's really hard to get a story that gets all of them. And this is something I was wrestling with when I was working on this stuff. It's like, well, okay, I've got the story. I'm thinking along this line of thought. Oh, but wait, I forgot about the stuff he does. It's like this story I've been giving. Then why does he need to intercede afterwards? Why is that a thing? And so, okay, well now I got that. But oh wait, is that how sacrifice works in the Old Testament? No, that's like this is the frustration, is really trying to take seriously incorporating every element in a way that's not a Frankenstein's monster. And so there was actually one of my professors when I was working on this when I was doing my doctoral program, and one of my my faculty mentors, I was talking with him about this stuff and bouncing ideas off him, and he had this thing. He's like, oh, he was kind of skeptical of my ability to like tie this all in a bit, and rightfully so. It was all in good fun. But he said, like, okay, maybe you need to recognize some of these different images are for different things, or maybe I could throw up my hands and say, okay, I don't have to put these in a coherent story. Maybe I can say this image is for this thing, this is for that, and that seems like the easy way out. I didn't want to do that, but there were times in desperation where I was sympathetic to do that. Okay, so let me bring it home. But there was this one strain of thought, like there's this one strain of biblical data, like this like little thread I was clinging to, and this like raging sea of biblical atonement motifs, and it made me think like, no, I can make this into a coherent story. And that's the idea of the divine counsel, which I talked about earlier, and the idea of accusations and advocacy in the heavenly places. So I'm gonna like go through this really quickly, and then I'll let you. I know I've been talking for a bit. So we already talked in the Old Testament. I already gave this kind of picture of like, okay, you've got this divine counsel, stuff like that. You've got these heavenly beings, whatever you want to call them, and they have authority, right? So in the divine counsel in the Old Testament, there's this theme of like cases are brought forth. So let me give you two examples of the Old Testament and give you some ideas in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, you have this in Job, right? Opening scene in Job, God's in heaven, sons of God come to present themselves. Oh, the Satan's there with him. And then God says, hey, look at Job. Isn't he pretty great? And I have some ideas on why God starts this, but like, I mean, that's another line of thought. So God's like, hey, look at Job, he's pretty great. And Satan says, no, you're wrong. Job, he only does this because, you know, you put a hedge around him. So essentially Satan accuses not only Job of, you know, kind of having a moral flaw,
True.
but Satan also accuses God of not knowing what he's talking about. So there's this accusation that's going on in the heavenly places.
He's basically saying you're lying. You're like, you either don't know what you're talking about or you're lying.
Yeah, he's like, so either you're lying or you just like, you don't know what you're going on about. And so like this is in the divine council, right? So this is like a pretty public, you know, slap to the face of the king there, right? So we get this idea in Zechariah, I think it's 3 or 4. I think it's Zechariah 3 of Joshua the high priest is standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan is there with him, and then Satan's like accusing him. Angel of the Lord says, nope, get lost, you know, like rebuke Satan. And then there's this interesting little thing about, you know, you know, change his garments, and then he tells Joshua, the angel of the Lord tells Joshua, I'm going to give you right of access among those who walk here, which I pick up later in my book briefly. But so you have accusation and advocacy in heaven there, right? Let's go to the New Testament. So I already gave this idea that of, you know, from the section from Romans and the section from Hebrews, like, oh, Christ is interceding for us. Why? Well, let's stop here and think. Why would we need Christ to intercede for us in heaven? Well, we already know there's this type of accusation that's going on there, right? So this is where I'll bring in Revelations 12. So you want to bring up Revelations 12 real quick? I feel like, is this what Joe Rogan feels like? Like, yeah, Jamie, pull that up real quick. You know, like, I'm not a Joe Rogan fan, but this must be what it feels like. I appreciate you doing that, by the way. Yeah, I saw you doing that.
I'm a visual person, so even if you didn't tell me to bring it up, I would bring it up anyways, because I learned this way by like listening and reading. Oh, Revelation, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I knew when I typed it in, I knew, I was like, Romans, that doesn't seem right. It's one of them are
yeah.
ones are.
I say, if I have habits of saying Revelations, and people will at me sometimes being like, there's no S. So if you want to scroll down a little bit to, I think it's the next pericope or the next break here. Yeah, okay, the dragon thrown out of heaven. We'll start reading at 7. Okay, so scroll back up to 7. Yeah. A little bit. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. So then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels also fought, but he could not prevail, and there was no place for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was thrown out, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the one who deceives the whole world. He was thrown to earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven. If you don't mind scrolling down a little bit. I heard the loud voice in heaven say, the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have now come. So there's that transfer. There's that transfer from one kingdom to the next. We keep going. Because the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been thrown down. This is the devil's disbarment. He was the accuser. He was the prosecuting attorney. He had a place before God day and night. He was accusing us. And now this accuser has been cast down. Think about how that fits with the Old Testament themes of divine counsel, accusation, advocacy. Now think about how that fits with the idea of Jesus is now our advocate in heaven. And then we get this phrase, they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb. Oh, the blood of the Lamb. That's the Jesus thing, right? So Jesus's blood has to do with the conquering of this accuser, and by the word of their testimony, for they did not love their lives to the point of death. Okay, so I've got this idea of Jesus doing something in heaven, and that is what I've got this idea of Jesus doing something in heaven and defeating accusers, stuff like that. Now I'm going to talk about this idea of the blood of the Lamb. I have a video on my channel. It's called something like, where did Jesus offer his sacrifice? Did Jesus offer himself as a sacrifice in heaven or on earth or something like that? Shouldn't be too hard to find. Just type in sacrifice in my search thing. And so in the idea in the book of Hebrews, so let me go back. So in the Old Testament Levitical system, let's say it's like Yom Kippur, right? Day of Atonement. This is the big one. I'm a high priest. I'm like, okay, I have an animal. I bring it. I put it on the place to kill. I kill it with a knife. I do the handling thing that Craig's gonna harp on me about. And like, okay, I've got this animal and blood's everywhere. Okay, so at that point, have I offered a sacrifice to Yahweh? No. All I did was kill an animal. It just in general, if all you do is kill an animal, and that's not enough to consider it an offering. An offering, the word offering, that word means giving a gift, a tribute to a deity, king, something like that, right? So an offering is made that is offered as a sacrifice. When you take the blood and you take it into the sacred space and you do something with it. This is usually called the blood manipulation in like academic work. And when you hear blood manipulation, you feel like, oh, that sounds weird. Like I'm manipulating my phone right now. Like think of it in a more like non pejorative way. So the idea is, in the Old Testament system, the sacrificial victim had to die, and then the high priest would take the victim's blood on Yom Kippur, would take it into the most holy place. And that's the place I argued briefly in my book. That's where God is. Actually, like we're kind of explicitly told, that's where God is. And the high priest essentially sprinkles it at the foot of an embodied or something like that, Yahweh figure. Now, that idea is something that gets picked up in the book of Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, the author draws this constant parallel between what the high priest on earth does and what the high priest in heaven is. And so in the book of Hebrews, and this becomes really explicit in chapter 9. Like chapter 9 of Hebrews is like the most explicit area of this. We're told that Jesus, so he dies, and he, as our high priest, he passes through the heavens, and he enters the heavenly most holy place, the one of, the real thing. The one on earth is just a copy of it. This is the real thing. So he passes into that, not with blood, not his own. So he is serving as the high priest, going in with the blood, but he was also the sacrificial victim. It's also his blood that's in his hand. And he goes and he offers himself as the final, perfect sacrifice to the Father. And once for all, and so on and so forth. And so the idea there is that just as the high priest in the Old Testament system would take the blood and he would sprinkle it in the sacred space, and through the sprinkling of it, purification would be made for the sacred space. That same idea gets picked up in the book of Hebrews, right? So the heavenly things need to be purified. Okay, so this is where I'm going to bring it home. So we have the idea in the book of Hebrews. Christ goes into heaven. He uses his blood in heaven to purify heaven. Okay, so Christ is doing something after his death in heaven with his blood that purifies heaven. Wait a second. Revelations 12 told me that something about Jesus's blood causes Satan to get cast out of heaven. Satan getting cast out of heaven, that kind of sounds like something that would come about from purification, right? And wait a second, what was Satan doing in heaven? Well, he was accusing us. Where was he accusing us? Well, we know this is divine counsel, and we know Jesus is now interceding. He's always there to intercede for us. And so this is kind of the conceptual matrix that I'm drawing on in my divine counsel book. And so I'll give you the hit here. I think on my blurb I say something like, Jesus's death wasn't enough to save you. You also needed a good lawyer. So my pitch for atonement is that the main thing that Jesus does for you is he comes into heaven. So there's this ongoing case in heaven against humanity and maybe even against God. I talk about that in my book, in which accusations have been brought against us. They've been brought against God. And what Jesus does is he comes in as our defense attorney, and he slaps down the accusations, right? The prosecutor that's been bringing these allegations, Jesus comes in, and he now serves as our advocate there. He serves as our kind of a defense attorney, and he destroys the case. He just annihilates the case that was being brought against us, and it is so bad that now Satan, it's like case over. You're not even going to come back from this. Like you're just cast out, right? And so that is something that incorporates the idea and the language of Christ's sacrifice, and incorporates the idea of Satan and the cosmic baddies being defeated, because they were defeated through this divine counsel. They're defeated through this stuff. And I would say that idea of Satan being defeated through some type of counsel scene is something we get in Daniel 7 as well. So it's Satan being defeated through this divine counsel stuff. I could go on a little bit more about how Jesus' death plays a role in that. I'll pause here because, like I said, I know I've been rambling a bit, but yeah, that's kind of my general thing. I don't even remember what your first question was, because I know I was.
No, that's good. We're kindred spirits, I kind of go all over the place and stuff too, so I'm not at all perturbed by it. I got the image. I don't know how many of you guys have seen that meme or the GIF or whatever, where it's like Zach Galifianakis and he's going shh, like this to the guy that's sitting. I just picture like Jesus arriving and he's like shh.
Yeah.
And then he, as a result, Satan gets kicked out, and he can no longer accuse us or whatever. So, I think that's really good. And the intercession is really what's been grabbing me, and I think I must have, because I think I listened to your episode where you were dealing with some philosophical issues with regards to the atonement, penal substitutionary atonement, and eternal conscious torment, and these kind of like units of suffering or torture or whatever. Now that's a whole other discussion. The point is, I've been thinking about, this is me chasing this random rabbit trail that doesn't have anything to do with this, but Intercession, right.
Mhm.
So this kind of segues me nicely into a point that you made from Isaiah 53, which I think I even commented underneath that video of yours. Was it your video? I think it was, where I said, like, so what do you think is the best penal substitution passage that people would go to? Because I think you were engaging like quite philosophically, and I thought, well, this is pretty compelling, but I want to talk about the Bible. Like where would they hang their hat? And you talked about Isaiah 53, and one of the things that you highlighted was this idea of intercession. And it's a Hebrew word that I've heard before in a book by Dutch Sheets. I don't know if any of our viewers have seen this. It's called Intercessory Prayer from Dutch Sheets. He's a real charismatic guy. It's his arguments from the original language are a little bit questionable, but it'll inspire you to pray. So if that's worth going through a book and chewing up the meat and spitting out the bones, then go for it. But he highlights this Hebrew word paga, which is apparently in Isaiah 53.
Mhm.
And I don't recall, because I remember highlighting it and thinking it was interesting, but just talk to our audience a little bit about this. I can't remember which word it is, but I have Isaiah here up, and this is the CSB. And it's interesting because you'll see here, I made a joke the other day on X. You'll see here in verse 6, it says, we all went astray like sheep. We all have turned to our own way. And the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of his all. So this is actually making an interpretive choice on one of these Hebrew words. And is this the Hebrew word for paga, or is that elsewhere in the passage?
Yeah. When you said that, I was like, I recognize that. And I was double checking. Yeah, I believe that's the one. Yeah. Paga. Yeah. So that's fun. So so what was the translation that you said did that as punishment?
This is CSB that we have in front of us, which ironically, the interview that I'm doing next week with Brother David Allen, he was on the committee that was like overseeing, this particular translation, and he's a PSA guy. So maybe we'll get a chance to ask him about that next week.
Yeah. So I'll show you a couple of interesting things. So so that's a highly interpretive decision. Let's step back a step and we'll get a slightly less interpretive decision, but still something that's not literal. So I'll just read it to you because it's really short. So this is the ESV. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Like, okay, now we're not getting punishment language, but we're still like, this still gets a pretty like PSA vibe. So you've got Jesus, God's taking our iniquity, laying it on him. Wow, that sounds like PSA. So here's the thing. If you look at this in the NET, right, and the NET with footnotes is pretty good because in the footnotes of the NET, they'll explain to you like interpretive controversies or textual issues. It's not like a full-blown like critical commentary, but it's a pretty good place, if you just off the cuff to look at something. If you look at this in the NET, and this is something I saw this, and I was like, what? In the NET, they translate this as, but the Lord caused the sin of all of us to attack him. Like, what? That seems like really different. Like, that seems like, especially if you're comparing it to something like the first one you mentioned, it's like, how do we get from God caused put on him all the punishment of us all? How do you get from that to God caused all of our sin to attack him? And so I was like, I gotta figure this out. I gotta look into what's going on here. And what I found was the NET is more of a literal translation there. Like if you were to just, not put any theological overtones to it, that's the more literal thing. So the word that's used there, it has the meaning of like to do this, like to bring two things together. That's a really oversimplified way of explaining it, but it has the idea of, things coming into contact with each other. And so there's idea, I think there's a section, it can have the meaning, if I'm remembering correctly, it can have the meaning of like violent force. I think there might be an instance where it's used to like refer to like a lightning or something hitting its mark. I'm going off my memory there, so don't take my word for that. I have this in my book, and my book is currently free as an ebook right now. So I think you're muted, Drew.
Sorry, I think I thought that I was muted, and then I muted myself to talk. But I think it's in Job, if I recall correctly, 36 for what it's worth. I'm sure you can chat GPT this, guys, and it'll just pop up. Who's doing Google these days? If you're using Google, you're basically a boomer, but moving on.
Yeah. So anyway, so to come to that point, so like, oh, this is really different, like what's going on here? And I started looking into this word, and what's interesting is, so like, this is a really good example of how the stuff that you think is really strong with PSA may not be coming from the text. It may be coming from interpretive decisions from the text. And I'm going to give the ESV like a pass, because like later on him, like that's pretty close to this idea of like, you know, like things coming in contact. The punishment thing, I'm like, okay, like I might like wag my finger at you a little bit and be like, come on, did you really need to do that? Because that's going past what I think like the Hebrew can merit there. But that's interesting, because like, listen, this idea of all of our sin attacked him or something in that line, well, like that's pretty on board with like a lot of alternative and non-PSA like atonement theory. So for instance, if you're a ransom guy, if you're a Christus Victor guy, you're gonna be like, yeah, all of our sin attacked him. God kind of in a sense gets Satan to attack Jesus, and as a result of that, so there's this imagery in the early church of God, it gives like Jesus's divinity as like this fish hook, and the flesh and the human, you know, nature of Christ or whatever is like the worm that's like hiding, you know, the hook underneath. And so Satan, who is this kind of this big, you know, cosmic sea monster, he bites down on the flesh of Christ only to find that there's the hook there that, you know, like you know, you catches him. Well, there's the idea of, you know, when Christ is swallowed by the you know, Leviathan, like his divinity causes death to vomit up all of its inhabitants. So this is an idea in non-PSA you know, models of God in a sense kind of bamboozles Satan and the cosmic baddies to attacking Jesus, you know, biting off more than they can chew with him. And through that process is bringing about this type of, you know, freedom of the captives. So it's like, yeah, like all of our sin attacked him. Like, what does that mean? Like I take this to mean referring to either you know, the consequences of sin, but I think this is probably more likely or something I would want to harp on, like the forces of sin. Like that's, you know, I think there, because no, like sin is not a literal object that's going to come like punch you in the face. So like a literal interpretation there is like not going to be a thing. But I think a non-PSA model can work quite well with that. But yeah, that was one of those really, as I worked through Isaiah 53, I found some really interesting connections where I'm like, oh yeah, like that's really different. And there's another connection that the connection between Isaiah 53 and Hebrews 5. I don't know how you felt about that connection, but I thought that was pretty interesting. And yeah.
I think that was probably one of your most compelling points in all of the book, that I thought that's really interesting, because you even said in your book, and I wish I could quote it. And for those of you that don't know, I don't know whether I've said this already, whether we said this already, but you can go to Amazon right now, James Agnew, The Devil's Disbarment, and your book should be free right now on Kindle, if people want it on Kindle. How long will it stay that way for people that are?
I plan on making it free permanently. Like, I plan for keeping it free for a while, like months or years. So fun fact, Amazon, like you can't just be like, set this as free. You have to do some like maneuvering things where you like set it free elsewhere and then tell Amazon to price match. And I don't have any plans to like take it down as being free. The reason I kind of hesitate there is I've been told that after a while, Amazon might kick it back up to the pre-price match price, but it should be free for a while. If not permanently, I'm not going to promise it's there permanently. For a while, it should be free. Yeah.
Sure. Well, if you go and buy the book for free, and if you enjoy it, you really like it, you can buy a hard copy and loan it to a friend and discuss it with them. I really enjoyed it. It's very digestible. It's a short book. You can get through it in a short amount of time. I wanted to say thank you to the super chat here from Denise. I think the first name there is Chris. I always space on this. Thank you so much for the super chat. Thank you for supporting the channel. It really helps make episodes like these. You can join the Patreon as well, patreon.com/Provision's Perspective, or you can join through the YouTube link, whichever one you want. We really appreciate all the help in that respect. Now, so let's talk a little bit about this Isaiah punishment thing, and I'll be kind of, for lack of a better term, devil's advocate here, and you'll have to kind of steer me in the right direction.
I'll disbar you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's where is the chastisement? Because that one's what verse?
It's 5. Yeah, it's up above that. Yeah.
Okay.
So in that verse, it renders it punishment as well.
Yeah. So this is the CSB, and it says, "He was pierced because of our rebellion, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment," so this is the chastisement, "for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds." Now, again, go and check out the book, because he gives, you give lots of references for this with regards to this word chastisement, often meaning instruction. You see it in Proverbs with like this idea of teaching. And so if you're going to kind of woodenly understand this as punishment across the board, you're going to have some issues, or you're going to start beating your children a lot. I don't know. And so you essentially highlight that it means instruction. And then if I recall correctly, your objection is, wait a minute, Jesus was instructed? Give me a break, James. What are you talking about? Of course, Jesus wasn't instructed. And then you said something to the effect of like, but maybe that's exactly what it's trying to teach because it teaches it elsewhere. And do you want to connect that?
Yeah. So the word there that's used is musar, and like I said, like you said, you can pick up the book to get some of the academic references, but some commentators have noted that this word has it doesn't have the connotation of like this legal, like judicial, like type of punishment that like PSA are probably reading into it. It has the connotations. I wouldn't give this a straight gloss of like teach or instruct, but rather it's more like disciplined or corrected. Like it's like the chastisement or that type of thing that's associated with the type of instruction that would be given from a father to a child, a father to a son, for a teacher to their student or something like that. So not really the legal framework. Okay, but no. So I wanted to clarify on that, because if somemene's like, wait, instructed, like this doesn't mean teach. Like
Sure. No,
it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but it's in that kind of general ballpark. So okay, so Craig gives this objection in his work. So Craig gives this objection of actually I have it. He says this punishment spoken of here cannot mean discipline, for it is clearly not the benefit of the servant who is driven to death, but for the benefit of those on whose behalf he suffers. Now, what I say is that Craig has dismissed this possibility too quickly, and what I point is that the scripture actually might explicitly teach that this is in some sense for the instruction or teaching or whatever of the servant. And what I do here is I link this to an often overlooked, at least it seems to be overlooked, text from Hebrews 5:7 through 10. So what Hebrews 5:7 through 10 says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reference. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So here's kind of the logic I run. If Jesus suffered, and as a result of that suffering, he learned obedience, doesn't that sound a lot like discipline / instruction? Like, and I'll set up the two syllogisms that I use in my book, considering the following logic in Hebrews 5. So I just read from Hebrews 5. Here seems to be the logic. 1, Jesus suffers. 2, as a result of this suffering, Jesus learns obedience. 3, because Jesus learns obedience, we can all be saved. Like, yeah, okay. That's Hebrews 5 in a nutshell, right? Now consider the logic that we see in Isaiah 53. 1, the servant suffers. 2, as a result of this suffering, the servant is said to be, instructed, corrected, disciplined, like that musar that we're talking about. 3, because the servant has that, we can all be saved. The similarity between these two passages is I think, too strong to ignore. And so this is something that I find this really interesting. And then I kind of, I don't know if I know this in my book, but this is something I'll note here. If you go down to in Isaiah 53 to, let's see if I can find, I think it's towards the end. The servant is said to make the many righteous because of his knowledge. So this is verse 11. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. So that fits in very well with, I think, the understanding of musar. It fits in with kind of the general understanding of musar. It fits in with Hebrews 5. And I'm going to say it fits in better with the entire context of Hebrews, because the entire context of Hebrews is talking about Christ becomes like us in all respects so that he can become our merciful high priest. He can be sympathetic with us. He was beset by our own weaknesses. That's an idea that I actually kind of talk about in my canonic Christology book, which is a different ballgame. But so that's how these are really, the language about on him was the punishment that brought us peace. Like, that's a really big one. That's one of the ones that people throw out a lot. We talked about the laid on him the iniquity of us all. Those are the two really, really big passages that in Isaiah 53 that people appeal to.
Got to take myself off mute again. No, yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think it reminds me of this passage, and there's something profound here, and maybe I'll go ahead and share this with you guys. This is somewhat of an unformed thought that came to me, hopefully, as I was seeking to pray without ceasing. I have one of those minds that doesn't turn off. And because of my hobby of theology, my mind is often thinking about those sorts of things. But then there is a fine line between kind of thinking about God and thinking towards God and talking to him. So anyways, I've been praying, and I've been using this. Maybe you guys can try this out. I don't think I have it on me, and I think I might have mentioned this with Will last week, but it's a little digital counter that you can put on your finger and count. I don't know what people use it for. I've heard that Muslims use it to say prayers, and they'll do like this or something, like to count on their fingers to say specific prayers. But anyways, as I walk and drop my children off, stay with me, people, okay? I know this seems like a Drew ADD rant, but stay with me. So as I'm walking, dropping my kids off at school in the morning, I see people and I count, the people that I see, and I pray for different types of people. And this passage that we're going to look at, some people think is about types of people. And why was I saying that? I was just saying that so that maybe you could try that sometime. Try one and pray for people and count them out. I think it's good fun. It helps me to pray. And I tell you what, seeing for me in a much larger city here, I don't know where you guys are, in terms of the rest of you viewers. James, if you're there in New Zealand, you might end up with 30 people on your hand at the end of the day. New Zealand is such a small country, but I'm having 250 people on my finger after a few hours or whatever. But anyways, so here's a passage. And the reason why this is ADD. I'm sorry, guys. Serious moment. When you see 100, even if it's 20 or 25, 50 people on your finger, you're like, man, there's a lot of people that need Jesus, that need to hear about him and stuff. And it's sobering, but hopefully invigorating in terms of seeing the need around you. So I recommend it. On to the passage that very long intro is going into. So here it says in 1 Timothy 2, we're all familiar with this. First of all, then I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. And here's intercessions be made for everyone, if for kings and all those who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior, who wants everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all, a testimony at the proper time. So we can see a huge part of this is Christ's mediation. And this is connected to him being a ransom. So this is definitely not something that we can discard as Christians. I mean, this is big. This is huge. And it's important to have that in mind. Now, my encouragement, my exhortation here, and my epiphany, that's like 3 E's. I should make a sermon out of that or something. Anyways, as I was praying, and for all these different people and other people that came to my mind, sometimes I was thinking about how, man, does this make a difference? Does just kind of saying these, 1-2 sentence prayer for all these different people, is this making a difference? And I started to get a little bit discouraged. And then I thought, you kind of have that piety thought of but maybe it's just for the relationship and the God glorifying aspect of things. It's no, but I want something to actually happen as a result of this. I'm not just praying the Puritan, get close to God type thing, even though I think that's very valid. But one thing that encouraged me as I was thinking about this, and I think the Lord must have just brought this to my mind, because I don't know how I made this connection. So here in this passage, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm just going to be way off base on this, and maybe everybody's going to be like, Drew, you don't know what you're talking about. But so he says the exhortation here, this is I urge, I exhort.
Mm-hmm.
Petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for all these people, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior. It seems to me that there are two options here that this can be good. Either God is saying this is good, that we live a tranquil life and stuff, but I was also thinking like, this is good and it pleases, like, are my prayers for all these people, regardless of what happens, pleasing to God? Because that seems like maybe that's what this is saying here. Or maybe he's just saying that it's we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness is good. This is good. Hope maybe it's all of it. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. James, you can feel
I want to sprinkle something in there. But what if every time you pray,
away.
Yeah, what if every time you pray, that is that thing you're asking for, what if that's something being brought before the divine council and being put before, the throne of God and those there? What if every time you pray, there's this, there's this idea in I think it's in one of Jesus's teachings in one of the Gospels of like, imagine the widow who keeps praying and keep pestering the king, pestering the king, and he says, if the king will do this, how, and he kind of draws the line there. And yeah, I would encourage people to at least go down the thought path of like, when you keep praying for these people, because I have my people that I pray for as well, and that's something. And this is actually an idea, if I remember correctly, this comes up in some Jewish thought of like, I think it's in one of the apocryphal works. There's an idea of one of the angels. He's the one who takes the prayers, before the throne. If I'm remembering correctly, I think that's in Tobit. But this idea of when we make prayers, what if that's us continually bringing the same case again and again before God, and continuing. And what if when we get more and more people to pray for something, that's more and more people, like that's the voice in the divine council growing louder and louder. Fun food for thought. Think about that. Do with it what you will. Maybe you chew it up and swallow it. Maybe you chew it up and spit it out. Maybe you just spit out the thoughts. I'll let that. I won't hang my hat on that, but I think that's an interesting idea.
No, I think it's a really good point. And I think we have to have these, when Jesus says something like that about the widow, I mean, he's telling us what prayer is like, and he's telling us that it's like you're heckling God and eventually God gives in. I mean, there's some kind of truth here that's encapsulated in this, and this might make us feel uncomfortable, or kind of one of those things that's like, well, put that in your theological pipe and smoke it. I don't know how to fit this into my classical theism or my whatever else kind of theology. And one thing that's kind of driven me crazy recently, and I think I can say this because I don't think any of my viewers are associated with these circles, but someone recently said, very influential, said, and has been saying to brothers and sisters around me, like, we ask God and we ask God and we ask him, and we ask and we ask and we ask, but we don't ever just like spend time with him or worship him and praise him and stuff, and we just, as though like asking and asking and asking isn't something that, like, when Jesus taught his disciples to pray, our Father who's in heaven, holy is your name, your kingdom come, your will be done as on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Mm-hmm. Forgive us our sins. There's so much asking in his own instructions to his disciples for prayer that I'm like, we really can't throw the baby out with the I mean, like, prayer in many respects, like, and I did the chat GPT on this. I said, I was in a meeting and this kind of was bugging my bonnet, or bee in my bonnet, whatever you call it, bugging my bonnet. And I said, right, I want you to look up exhaustively in the Bible all of the prayers, and I want you to categorize them according to asking or kind of a more worshipful submission to his will type thing. And unsurprisingly, like, just think about the Old Testament and prayer. there's so much asking happening, you know, and there is worship and there is submission to will. Anyways, that was the bee in my bonnet that I just needed to let out. So we really can't swing the pendulum the other way to where we feel ashamed or like, oh, I shouldn't ask God. He's our Father. Like, and you know, one thing, sorry, now I'm going on a rant, but one thing I'm learning
preach,
about being
brother.
a parent.
Preach. Yeah. Like, I'm like, hey man, I'm here for it. Yeah. Like,
one thing I'm learning about this, I'm a relatively new parent. You know, my oldest child is 5 and we have a 2-year-old. She's turning 5 very soon. And she, especially her, because she's got the community, you know, she can talk and stuff. So she'll ask for something and then ask for something and she wears me down. And I'm just like, okay, fine. And it's one of those things that's like, it's not a like, you know, she could have it, not have it. You know, I'm just kind of being a little bit stubborn by saying no up front. And I'm not saying God's being stubborn, but Jesus himself says that prayer is like this, that it's like this widow that's heckling this judge, you know. And I just kind of had this moment like, okay, I should be encouraged in prayer to heckle you, Lord. And then I think it was like just a few days later that this person was like, we just ask and ask and ask and we don't. And I was like, you hush you.
Yeah, like God's fine with that. Yeah, I don't think God's getting mad about you coming to him too much in prayer to ask for stuff. Like I think he probably wants more of that. So
totally. This is live, Floral from Under a Rock. Welcome to our live broadcast. Those of you that are listening later, this is not live. I don't know how that's going to work, but assume most of you that are going to click on this are going to know that it's not live, but it's not a lie.
Help, we're trapped. We're eternally trapped in your screen. We've been sucked in. We're live.
I did an announcement for this series the other day before I interviewed Will, and I did it for the first time on my phone, like right here in this little clip next to me, I think, and I didn't know how to turn it off. And somebody in the comments was like, this is your life now, Drew. You're live forever. You don't know how to turn it off. And I figured it out in the end. But
I had an awkward experience on a live stream with, like, oh, how do I get this guest off? Like, I accidentally like accepted like a thing, and a guy was just sitting. It was really weird. He was just, he would think he was in another country. I don't know if he spoke English, and he was just sitting there looking at me. And I was like, I don't know how to get this guy off. I think I accidentally accepted like a co-host thing, and so I'm like in the live. I'm like, I'll be back, guys. And I was in the live and started again. And then people in my chat were like, that's funny, you know, like that's when you can roast me. That's when you can get out the, I'm not a boomer, but that's when you can, like me and my friend Than, who was on Exploring Reality, I've done live streams with him, and like anytime we have technical difficulties, we're just like, yeah, just mock us, like we're just don't know what's going on.
Right. Yeah. It's a practiced art for sure. There's lots of things that can go wrong here and that, but I'll engage with a few of the comments here, and then we'll probably close it on. We'll close it on up. I can't talk tonight. So Peter says, sorry for banning you last time, Peter. Again, welcome back. Glad to have you. So he says, Drew said the persistent widow story is about heckling God. Yeah. I mean, you got to figure out where to put it in your theology one way or another.
Well, here's the thing. It's about heckling God. But if God operates through a divine council, right? Like if God doesn't just make executive decisions all by himself, like if there are other people, other beings who are involved in these type of decisions, if God's delegating authorities, then it's not just heckling God. It may be heckling multiple divine beings. You know, it may be one of those things like there are conditions that are met before, you know, something is granted, or it may be, you know, do with that as you will, but if God incorporates his divine counsel into the decisions that he makes, which we know he do from that section from 1 Kings I read, then like maybe if you don't like the idea of heckling God, maybe factor that, put that in your theological pipe and smoke it, as Drew said.
Yeah, there's an Elohim over this particular region of the world who I need to like heckle, and he's gonna like get over it and then be like, fine, let's talk about this together, guys, you know, and then it gets deliberated and actioned or something like that. We're going to get clipped and a response and just heretics and all that stuff.
I have a friend and we talk about this stuff. Like we probably make it's like the way we talk about it sometimes. Like we make it into like a comedy skit. You know, it's like, and like I don't mean this in any way. By the way, if I ever say anything flippant when it comes to theology stuff, it's not me like mocking or making light. So like there's this quote by G.K. Chesterton, something along the lines of like, I'm not gonna quote it exactly, but the general lines of it is like, yeah, like the more serious it is, the more important it is you joke about it, or something along those lines. And so it's like like me joking about stuff doesn't like go against me taking it seriously. But me and my friend, like we kind of put these things into funny scenarios. Like imagine, yeah, this is Elohim who's just like going about his business, and then he's just like, oh my gosh, Drew, again, no, I'm not gonna give you a girlfriend right now. You don't need, he's like, we've been over it. Like I find that funny. I like that. Like I like the comedic aspect of that. Yeah.
No, for sure. And we, that's one of the things that Eric and I, and he's no longer with us, my host emeritus, but we take theology very seriously, but we also really like to have fun and like to make it interesting. Whereas some people on YouTube or podcasting or whatever are just very like, this is theology and we must take God very, very seriously. Whereas like, well, yes, but he's also our father, and he's also given us a sense of humor, and I think he can handle us laughing.
You don't think Jesus ever cracked a joke?
Stuff.
Yeah.
You're trying to get the speck out of you, and you got a big old log in your own eye. How do you see God? How do you see Jesus telling that parable? Is it a joke? Does it have a little bit of a funny flair? Yeah. So a few of the last questions here. So
yeah, feel free to if we have questions coming in that are good, like I'm not in a super rush. Like I know I give you a general time frame, but if we've got good questions coming in, feel free to bring them in. Yeah,
sure. And if you type question all caps, that helps me see it more, because a lot of you guys have conversation in chat, which is fine, but it's difficult to see questions if it's not like kind of highlighted or I'm tagged in some way. But here's one from Thomas Fraxilius. Now hang on. Isn't Fraxilius the last name of a board game inventor? You need to tell me in the chat, because that's ringing bells right now. I'm going to have to Google it later. Maybe it's not. Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyways, he says, but wasn't it God who laid on him the sins of us all?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So there's actually two sections in Isaiah 53 you can make this argument. One is you could do it in the section of he laid the iniquity of all, laid the punishment, whatever. You could do it in that section, but there's also a section later where it says, different translations translate it differently. Some say it pleased the Lord to crush him. Some say it was the will of the Lord. I think that's probably more accurate. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. And so the idea here is like, hey, listen, it's saying God's the one who did this. And so this is a decent argument at first glance, but I don't think it's going to get you where you want to go, and here's why. So in the Old Testament in general, there's this idea of, I think it's called the active verbal form, which is the idea that if God allows something, sometimes they will say God did it. So let me give an example. I think it's when Saul dies, and this is in like the same passage. So Saul is described as falling on his sword. So the idea seems to be he kills himself. I say, so okay, like who died? Who killed Saul? Saul, right? Saul killed Saul. So he falls on his sword. But then later in that same passage, it says something like, but then the Lord put him to death. Like, but wait a second, like, did God kill Saul or did Saul? It's like, so like this idea of the Lord doing something, like that is a way of saying, if God allows it, you can say like God did this. Or for instance, if God allows, like a country or another nation to come in and like wreak havoc on Israel, you could say like, oh, God's done this to us. So I would want a couple things here. I'd want to be careful about saying that active verbal form. Now, I was actually looking up when I saw this pop up. I had somebody mention this to me the other day. And they said that this same language is used in the end of Job. I haven't checked this, but they say that in the end of Job, it talks about all that God had taken from Job. I haven't double checked that, so double check that. That's not one of the examples I go to, but if that's the case, that's a good one, because that's an instance in which that would be an instance in which God allows it to happen through Satan doing all this stuff, but God's not the one doing that. But like I said, I double check that. But the one in Saul is a good instance. And I think there are a couple other sections in scripture. So that's my first thing, like have to be careful about this active verbal form. And I'll add into that, we know that other in some sense, other people, like other humans or cosmic baddies were involved in killing Jesus. So, for instance, in the New Testament, I think it's in Acts, Peter is talking to the Jews and he says, "This man, Jesus, who you killed." I think there's a phrase somewhere in the Bible about lawless men being the ones who killed Jesus. And so here we have, it seems to be like we can cash this out in the same way we do like with Saul or other instances of the active verbal form, which is God had this plan, and in this plan, he allows, he allows either evil men or the Jewish leaders or whatever to kill him, to kill Jesus, and because of that, we can say that God, caused the sin of us all to attack him. He set up the scenario and allowed it. Now, I could give a thought. I gave the thought experiment earlier about the fish and the bait. Like if I'm fishing and I take this nice juicy hook and I take this hook and I put a nice juicy worm on it and I cast it out, and then a fish comes along and says, delicious, and he chomps down on it, and I reel it in. We would say like, oh yeah, I caused the fish to attack my hook. I caused the fish to get caught. It's like, yeah, but I didn't like swim out into the water, take the fish and eat it. Like I didn't do that. Like the idea there is that God set up this means through which he he knew this would happen. Or we might say this in like a chess game, right? Like I set up like a juicy queen sacrifice or something, right? Like I make my, oh look, it looks like I blundered my queen, and then you take it and then I get checkmate, right? We might say that we might use that same type of causal language. So yeah, at first glance, this type of type of stuff does seem like intuitive, and it does seem reasonable. But I would say once we factor in the fact that Jesus's death is described elsewhere in the Bible as being at the hands of evil persons, and that we know that there's this type of active verbal form where God can be described as doing something if he just allows it, and then the kind of fishhook scenario, I think that's probably a better interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you bring out a really valid point there, because and we get into this in a lot of our conversations with the theological determinists, the Calvinists, in that like these passages aren't necessarily describing metaphysics of what's happened, what's happening behind the scenes. Language is flexible and it's used in these ways, much like you've described. So that's really good. The next question here from Scott's Episcopalian is probably one of the best arguments for PSA from kind of like implications rather than kind of like a specific exegetical that this is specifically teaching this. So Scott's Episcopalian asks, isn't it the case that, and sorry, Brother Scott, I'm just going to call you Scott, even though that's probably not your name, but I think this was from way early in the broadcast. Hopefully you're still listening. Isn't it the case that if we acknowledge the wages of sin is death, and given that Christ died for our sins, ergo Christ was our penal substitute?
Yeah, so I don't see how you could get to that. And I'll say as a maybe more in-depth thing. So I have a video on my channel where I go through language of debt and ransom. I'm going to try to find that real quick. That way, this will be a more in-depth answer to, I think, most verses in the New Testament that talk about either a price being paid or talks about debt language. I think this will be relevant. So that is called, I think this is Who Did Jesus Pay? What Penal Substitution Gets Wrong About Debt. So that's a video on my channel. I'll reference people
that. Send it to me when you're finished. Send it to me when we finish, and I'll put it in the description so people can link to it. And that way they'll link to your channel as well.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, my way of responding to this is like, so what Paul is getting at here is that like, if you sin, the consequence of that is death. Like that is kind of what naturally comes about. And I think I do go into this in more depth. I'm like, it's been a while since I made that video. But yeah, so I think the idea here is like, Paul is just setting up this type of like connection between like an action and its consequences. And what was the verse of that, by the way? What's in Romans, right? What's the Romans verse?
Yeah, 6:23 it should be.
Yeah,
I'm remembering. And then died for our sins would be what Craig had referenced, which would be 1 Corinthians 15, 3-ish.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would want to do is, I think I do this in that video, is I would look, and Paul seems to be just pulling on the idea of what are the consequences of sin. So he does this in verse 20, for when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. But what fruit were you getting at that time? Okay, so fruit is the idea of, a plant produces fruit according to, what type of plant it is, right? So, but what fruit were you getting at that time from the things of which you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. Okay, so the idea here is the fruit of your sin. What grows from your sin is death, right? And so this seems to be consequence language. And he sets this up first with this fruit language. Then he says, now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves of God, the fruit you leads to the fruit you get leads to sanctification and its end eternal life. So again, we get this fruit language as kind of fruit analogy. And then Paul says, for the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our God. So what I'm going to say here is that, listen, Paul is talking about the consequences of your actions, like the maybe you could say the natural consequences of your actions, or something along those lines. There's no reason to read in that this is punishment. Like Paul had already, I think, and the reason, and in the person who asked this, in their defense, I understand why this wage language, I understand why one might be tempted to do this, because the language about wages, debt, and ransom in the New Testament, it can be, if you're not paying attention, or at least if you're not being like really nuanced, it can be a little tricky, and that's something I talk about in that video. But to put a bow on this, I would say if we look in that passage, it seems like Paul is giving two different metaphors, or two different ways of expressing the idea of when you sin, the consequences of that sin is death. And so we could say that Christ suffered the consequences of our sin. There's no way to get around that. Like the consequences from our sin, the way I would cash it out is I say the consequences of sin is things like death, captivity, and oppression by Satan and the cosmic baddies, things along those lines. And I think we should say that Christ did experience those things. It isn't just that Christ experienced death. It wasn't just physical death. Christ experienced oppressions at the hand of Satan. Like Christ experienced the oppression and the maltreatment at the hand of the ruler of this world. So that's how I want to draw on that. And like I said, really highly recommend that video for the other wages, debt language, because, and I'll put this on the thing, there are actually some passages in the New Testament that talk about the idea of debt that don't mesh with penal substitution. I don't touch on these in my book. I think I talk about them a little bit in that video. There's language in the New Testament that talk about God just forgiving the debt, right? He doesn't require someone else to come and pay it. He just forgives it. So I'll leave that as the kind of teaser for that video. But yeah.
Well, and I gotta say, one thing that I've been thinking about as I'm reading all of this and thinking about specifically more so the Old Testament and how forgiveness works, because the idea behind penal substitution is that you need a substitutionary sacrifice that propitiates, that causes God to be merciful in order for him to be able to forgive you. And if you think about Adam and Eve, was that a sacrifice? Sure. Animals, skins. Were they punished? Were they punished in their stead? I don't know. You think Moses, his intercession, like God's getting ready to destroy all of them, he intercedes. There's no mention of a sacrifice whatsoever, and God relents and he spares them. You take Hezekiah, who humbles himself. He says, God says, you are about to die. You will not recover. And he humbles himself and he repents. Correct me if I'm wrong, chat, people in the comments. There's no sacrifice mentioned there. In Psalm 51, even like when he's praying for forgiveness, he's like, he doesn't say like, hey, I made this sacrifice, God. I think that it's even, I'm not sure if it's in Psalm 51, but elsewhere I've mentioned where it talks about the sacrifices of a broken heart, or what you desire. And there's this Old Testament motif, which I think you touch on, and maybe Will does as well. I get them a little bit blended because I'm reading all these books at the same time. But where brain fart.
While you think about that, I'll give an example I like. So in Ezekiel, God says, I searched for a person to stand in the breach, right? So this is the massive paraphrase. I searched for a person to stand in the breach between me and you. I searched and searched as someone would repair this relationship. And why does God didn't want to destroy them? God wasn't out here like hankering. He's like, oh boy, we've got a sin on the board. It's time to, make sure that the scales are balanced. And now I have to go punish Israel. Like he doesn't want to do that. He's searching for someone to intercede and stand between him and Israel. And so that could not occur. But then, unfortunately, right, he can't find someone to stand in that breach, and so then they have destruction brought upon them. There's passages where God says things like, essentially he's saying, yeah, listen, if I'm punishing you, if I'm doing X, Y, Z, and these are things, that are associated with punishment, and you just repent and come back, I'll relent from what I'm doing to you. He doesn't say, okay, after you do that, I will continue to punish you according to what is, metrically required by my retributive justice, in proportion to your sin, and then I'll stop punishing you. He doesn't say, he's just like, yeah, you stop doing your nonsense, and I'll stop, punishing you for this. Like, I'll stop, inflicting this on you. The idea that God is unable to forgive. That's something that it isn't in the Old Testament. And the go-to way that penal substitution advocates get around this is they just say, oh, well, he's able to do all those things because of Jesus. Like, this is the go-to argument. Well, like, he forgives all that then because Jesus is going to come along. And I have a couple problems with this. One, the text doesn't say that. That's a kind of rhetorical maneuver or an ad hoc explanation that it's not in the text itself. That's something you have to invent or bring into this. And what I'm going to say is like, well, why should we do that unless we're just like previously biased towards PSA? But the other thing I'm going to point out, and like maybe you weigh this as heavy, maybe you weigh this as don't, it's like, well, like the people who are writing Psalms don't know that. The people who are reading or listening to Isaiah, Ezekiel, they don't know that. So like what you're saying is God is giving them a false picture of his ability to forgive for like hundreds of years. Like God is saying this stuff, which absent from this, supposed thing that comes, about, and he holds off on the punishment with Jesus. Like God is saying and phrasing things in such a way that he is setting up false conceptions about his ability to forgive. And it's only way later that, if we adopt this PSA framework, then we have an explanation and we can go back and correct that. It's like, isn't a simpler way just to be like, no, God is speaking to the people like at the time, and he's being serious when he says, I'll forgive you, like that's there. Or, either God is, being serious, or, either the psalmist or whoever is writing it is serious when they're expressing this idea like, oh, God forgave me. Like, this is great. I'm pretty happy about this. So yeah, I think you're right on the ball there.
Because generally what I've heard and what I've said and told people is that the Old Testament saints had just enough knowledge. For instance, in Job, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And so I would say regarding a passage like that, or like others, that they're forward looking to this, like there's some kind of solution that I guess involves a sacrifice. So they're putting their hope forward into the atoning sacrifice, which is Christ. Like that's, I mean, that regardless of what model you hold to, he is the expiation, the atoning sacrifice, however you want to say that. And so they were looking forward to that. And so it was in that sense that they were forgiven. But if you're just taking and I'm saying this as someone that's wrestling through this, that's trying to look at the biblical data and just saying like, okay, let's assume that PSA is true for Christ and that this is how it works or whatever. I'm just trying to look at the Old Testament data and go, if this is an essential way that God forgives, much like Craig has said in this clip, an essential part of the good news, then, the Moses thing, you cannot understate the gravity of that event in the birth of the nation of Israel. And there's no, I guess it was before the giving of the law. Maybe you could make that argument, but even so, there were sacrifices that happened before this. So I don't know, and I'll say this as we're kind of wrapping things up a little bit here. The goal of this series is I'm wrestling through this. And so I guess I'm kind of taking you guys, perhaps unwillingly, on the journey with me, but is to create some interaction on this issue. So any questions that you have or any pushback you have, let us know in the comments. That's really important and really helpful, I think, as part of this dialogue. And especially if you have a podcast or a YouTube channel, I would love for you to take this conversation or Will's conversation or an upcoming conversation. If you're someone like James, I've got a few guys that I'm like, hey, I'm about to have this interview. Feel free to take clips from that and talk about it on your channel, because I want this to be part of a larger conversation so we can actually drill down into this together. So all of that said, feel free to do response videos for like the two of you, I don't know, that are, I think Twitchy was in the chat earlier, and he's already, Brother Jerry, I'm debating him here in a few weeks on determinism. He's already talked about doing a response to Warren and I told him to be sure to check out the episode with Will, and maybe this one as well. But I'd love to hear, pushback, because like I said at the very beginning of this, there's kind of two different sides of the coin here. There's PSA is essential, and if it's essential, we really don't want to reject it. We really don't want to get it wrong, and we want to defend it properly. But if it is wrong, and if it is problematic, and it is a stumbling stone for people that ought not be there, and that's preventing people from coming to faith, or is causing people to question, like, why does God need to be appeased? Maybe they're thinking about God's character in this way. Then that needs to be addressed and removed as an obstacle. We don't want to put anything in people's way to coming to faith, or just growing in their faith, that doesn't need to be there. I mean, that's one of the main things. My own, just a side note, so one of my own personal visions or burdens comes from a passage that is, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. And I think that that's just so true in life, especially when it comes to the good news of Jesus. I mean, so many people just, even among us believers, can't really articulate it all that well. I mean, most of you are theology geeks and stuff, and you can, but many people cannot. And there's apologetics things that we need to know to be able to defend our faith. There are things that unbelievers don't know. There's things in life that we don't know. And so part of the vision behind this is putting stuff out there that hopefully is helpful in that respect, and is bringing some knowledge, not from me, but from the Word of God, as we've discussed today, from Yahweh himself. Chew up the meat and spit out the bones. Not everything I say is gospel truth, I'm sure. And I'm sure Brother James would agree. But yeah.
I wanted to add it. Yeah. So can I add in something real quick? Sorry, I don't want to lose this. So yeah, because I want to make this clarification. I made this clarification on a few interviews, and something you said a little bit ago reminded me of this. And so unfortunately, maybe it's going back a bit, but if I am, forgive me. When, let's say you have a model, or with anything, like with atonement, with some scientific model, whatever. When you have some theory, you can continue to alter that theory and make what we would maybe call ad hoc alterations to that theory. You can continue to do that as new data comes around. So you continue to kind of like redraw the lines and keep postulating things as explanatory mechanisms. You can keep doing that until the cows come home. But there's going to get to a point where what you end up with is it's just like this really messy, like convoluted over postulates of things, where what you really should have done is kind of just gone back to the drawing board. So a good example of this is within philosophy of science. There's this famous work by, I think it's Kuhn's, and he talks about scientific paradigm shifts. And the idea is we have this paradigm that we work within. Maybe it's like a certain model of physics. Maybe it's like Newtonian physics or something like that. And we work under this paradigm. And as progress gets made, we fit things into that paradigm. But then there comes a time where there just has to be a paradigm shift. Like there just has to be this big, like, recognizing like, okay, the facts have accumulated to the point that like this just isn't fitting it as well, so we need to shift paradigms. And so I say this because I want to like I gave that example while you were like, oh, a PSA person is just going to postulate this, or just going to postulate that. You can do that all you want. You can say, from anything I say, you can save PSA if you're willing to make enough ad hoc, amendments. If you're willing to break up the Sharpie and keep, redrawing the lines, you can come up with some contrived stuff to make it work and to, make that postulate. But what I'm saying is maybe it's time for a paradigm shift in your thought, and maybe let's just start let's go back to the basics and let's start from the ground up. Instead of starting with your PSA and trying to defend it from objections, let's go back to the Bible, start from the ground up, and see what do we actually need to account for? Like, what does the Bible say that we need to account for? And does PSA make the cut? Is PSA even a piece on the table that needs to get factored in? And this is where I'm going to toot my horn in a sense and say my chapter and some of the videos I put out on my channel, I think I show pretty well that PSA and the conceptions of that, they're not on the table of things that need to be factored into our explanation. And so if they're not there, and this is where I'm going to bring it home to something Drew said, if they're not there, if this is something that's not on the table that we have to factor it in order to have any type of plausible, or a good explanation of the biblical data, why are we forcing it in when we know, listen, regardless of what your views are on PSA, we know this is a stumbling block for people. We know that, we know Muslims say, why can't Allah just forgive? That's what he does with us. We know atheists will object and be like, what? You don't have to look too far on TikTok to, see people objecting to this idea. We know this is a stumbling block for people. And so if we're starting from the ground and working our way up and we see that there are really plausible, not ad hoc, good explanations for these go-to PSA text that are coherent, like why are we shoehorning this in? And so yeah, I'm really with Drew when he says let's not, the Bible says stuff that's going to cause us to be countercultural. Like the Bible's going to say stuff that makes us
Totally.
Unpopular. There are going to be stumbling blocks there, but we shouldn't just multiply those stumbling blocks unnecessarily if we don't have to. So I just wanted to tag that in. That was, I thought, a good line of thought that you said.
I think there's a common sentiment in at least my own circles and upbringing, evangelicalism, Protestantism, whatever, that if something's difficult to accept or hard, then that must be the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably not a very good way of operating in terms of, I don't know what you would call it, epistemically evaluating truth, just because something, and there's a certain amount of piety that comes with this is a hard truth and I believe this. And for instance, something that I engaged with you early on, James, was your response to Mike Winger on complementarianism and egalitarianism. And sometimes I've been in the camp of, I'm a complementarian and this is a hard truth and I'm holding on to this because it's countercultural and stuff. But if it's not biblical, it can be a pretty big stumbling block, for people and stuff. And so you want to have the truth and not things that are going to be stumbling blocks for people. But that's kind of next on my investigative list. I don't think that our audience will really go for much of that because our niche here is kind of theology, soteriology type of thing. But what do you think about spoiling the end of your book? Can we read the last few lines of your book that I just think's a really good zinger, and then we can
by all means
close it out here.
Zinger. I'm not sure if zinger's the word. I feel like my last word is very uplifting. I don't know. I feel like this is a zinger. I feel like it's very
it's funny because as I've learned, reading on Kindle and things, sometimes you can get to a book and it's approaching 85%, and then it'll just end, and you're like, oh right, the last 15% are the references and stuff. And so I've kind of learned to expect that a little bit. And yours was crescendoing, and I was like, "Oh, yep, I think that this might be up. Yep, that's the end of the book." And it comes up and tells you to rate it and stuff. And I was like, "That makes sense." He saved his punchy line for last, but I'll put this up here, and I'm going to let you read it since you're the author. It can be in the author's voice, and then I'll give our usual little wee outro that we have here. Is that big enough for you to see? I can make
it, so the section that you have highlighted for the audience.
Yeah, hang on. I'm gonna make it
for the audience. I'm over here for the audience. We'll make it bigger.
both.
Drew's got my back here. Yeah. Okay. Salvation is not chiefly about what we are being saved from. It is about what we are being saved to. You are being saved from the captivity of Satan and death, but you are being saved to eternal participation in God's family. You are being saved to a seat in the divine council and co-rulership of all things. You are being saved to participation in the divine nature. As the Apostle Paul said, no eye has seen, no ear heard, no the heart of man imagined what God has in store for those who love him.
So be it. That's a good line to end on. If you appreciate this content, like the video. Stay tuned for the interview that's coming up next week with Brother David Allen. Thanks for coming on, James. And everyone, you are blessed. So go be a blessing to someone this week. Peace out.